Welcome to my channel. It is June 5th, 2020, 5 a.m., Hanahan, South Carolina. A call comes into the emergency dispatch center. On the other end of the line is 7-year-old Matthew Speck. His voice is shaky. His breathing is heavy. And according to Matthew, 2 intruders have just broken into his home in the upscale Eagle Landing neighborhood. He tells the dispatcher that the men attacked him and his wife while they were asleep. He says he's been injured. It sounds like a terrifying home invasion. But when police arrive, the scene doesn't look like a home invasion at all. Dawn hasn't broken yet. The neighborhood is still covered in darkness. Officers secure the property and begin examining the house. The front doors are locked. The windows are intact. There are no obvious signs of forced entry. Inside, almost everything appears untouched, until officers reach the second floor. In one of the bedrooms, they find 3-year-old Caitlin Speck lying on the bed. She is unresponsive. And at the foot of the bed, lying on a rug where she often napped, is the family's golden Labrador, Bailey May. She is dead too. Matthew is alive. He meets officers with blood on his clothes. There are fresh cuts across his forearms and stomach. He tells detectives that he received those injuries during a struggle with the alleged attackers. According to Matthew, the men fled moments before police arrived. But as investigators begin looking more closely at the house, something becomes increasingly difficult to explain. The wallets are still there, the electronics are still there, the jewelry is still there. Nothing has been ransacked, no drawers have been opened. There is no obvious attempt to steal anything. The house is neat, almost completely untouched, except for the bedroom where Caitlin and Bailey were found. And suddenly, investigators are left with a question. If 2 men really broke into this house, where did they go? To understand what happened that morning, investigators would eventually have to look back 12 years, because the story didn't begin with that emergency call. It began in 2008. In 2008, Caitlin Conran met Matthew Speck at a community event. Caitlin was born on August 18, 1986. By the time of the 2020 incident, she was working from home as a designer. Her life was centered around Hanahan and the 2-story house she shared with Matthew in the quiet Eagle Landing neighborhood. During the day, Caitlin's constant companion was Bailey May, a golden Labrador she considered more than just a pet. Bailey was part of the family. Matthew Speck was 37 years old when the incident occurred. He had been living with Caitlin since the early years of their relationship. From the outside, their life appeared steady. They owned property. They invested in improvements to their home, and they didn't publicly air their personal problems. Caitlin had plans for the house. She was preparing for a major renovation. She talked with friends about interior ideas. She spent time selecting design materials. She often talked about how much she enjoyed the peacefulness of suburban life and the freedom that came with working from home. Everything suggested continuity. The house was being improved. Her work continued. Bailey remained part of her daily routine. There was no indication that Caitlin was preparing to abandon the life she had built. But behind that apparently stable home, people close to Caitlin had begun noticing something. Matthew was changing. During the final years of their marriage, Caitlin reportedly confided in people within her inner circle about an increasing emotional distance. Matthew was spending more time away from home. His conversations with Caitlin had become colder. The relationship was no longer what it had once been. Still, Caitlin continued putting time and money into the house. She wasn't seeking a separation. She hadn't searched for another place to live. Her belongings remained where they had always been. Her design sketches were still on the table, building supplies were still stacked in the garage, and Bailey remained at the center of her daily routine. This was Caitlin's home, her workspace, her sanctuary. But according to investigators, while Caitlin continued living her normal life, someone else had already begun thinking about the future of that home, and that person was the man she shared it with. While medics treated Matthew's injuries, forensic investigators began examining the Speck property. Their first priority was determining how the alleged intruders had entered. There was an obvious problem. They couldn't find an entry point. The perimeter showed no sign of forced entry. The front door was secured with a deadbolt and an internal latch. The windows were unbroken. Their frames were tightly sealed. The mesh screens showed no cuts or pressure marks. Nothing suggested that someone had forced their way inside. Then investigators began examining the interior. Caitlin's wallet was sitting undisturbed on a side table. Cash was still inside. Her credit cards were still there. In the living room, expensive laptops and other electronics remained exactly where they had been. No drawers had been pulled open, the clothes in the closets were untouched, and there was no obvious sign that someone had stormed through the house looking for valuables. The floors provided another problem. There were no obvious footprints, no streaks of dirt, no clear evidence of multiple people moving quickly through the home, and there was no indication of a struggle involving several people. The bedroom where Caitlin had been found was eventually sealed off as investigators worked. Matthew's version of events was straightforward. Two men had entered, they had fired shots, they had attacked him, and then they had escaped. But the physical scene told investigators something very different. If someone had escaped through the front door, they would have needed to deal with the deadbolt and internal latch. Yet both were secured. There was no evidence of lockpicks, no indication that spare keys had been used, and the windows offered no alternative route. The mechanics of the house were becoming impossible to reconcile with Matthew's account. The evidence suggested something unsettling. When the shots were fired, the only living beings known to be inside were Caitlin, Matthew, and Bailey May. The alleged break-in was beginning to fall apart. The house was effectively sealed. No obvious entry, no obvious exit, and no obvious intruder. The next question concerned Matthew himself. He had blood on his clothes. He had cuts across his arms and torso, and he claimed those injuries came from fighting armed intruders. But forensic specialists examining the wounds reached a different conclusion. The cuts were shallow. Their edges were relatively smooth. They didn't resemble the jagged or torn wounds investigators might expect from someone fighting off repeated knife strikes. There were also no obvious defensive wounds, no deep cuts across his palms, no significant injuries on the backs of his hands, nothing that strongly suggested he had grabbed a blade or tried to shield himself from an attacker. Instead, experts described the injuries as consistent with self-inflicted or hesitation marks. The locations mattered. The wounds were positioned on areas Matthew could easily reach himself. Then investigators examined the blood on his clothing. Again, the evidence didn't fit the story. A genuine struggle involving movement could produce a chaotic blood pattern. Sprays, smears, irregular distribution. But the blood evidence associated with Matthew appeared much more controlled. The picture of a husband desperately fighting for his life was becoming difficult to maintain. There was another problem. Matthew's account of the alleged attackers wasn't staying consistent. Their descriptions changed. Details about their height and clothing were difficult for him to maintain. But one thing remained consistent. His attention stayed focused on his own injuries. Medical reports confirmed that none of his wounds were life-threatening. They didn't require advanced surgical treatment. They were relatively neat. And they appeared to have been made at deliberate angles. Investigators compared those findings with the crime scene. The floors were largely spotless. There was no obvious evidence of a physical struggle, and the only surviving person inside the house had relatively minor injuries. The supposed battle for survival was becoming harder and harder to believe. Then investigators examined the second victim, Bailey May. The family's golden Labrador had been found at the foot of the bed. For detectives, Bailey's death became an important part of understanding what happened. Ballistics testing indicated that Bailey had been shot with the same weapon used against Caitlin. The shot appeared to have been fired from close range. Bailey was lying in the place where she normally stayed. There was no indication that she had attempted to attack or flee. She never got the chance. And that raised another important question. What would a dog do if a stranger suddenly entered the home? Neighbors later described Bailey as vocal around unfamiliar people. She would bark when someone she didn't know approached the gate or entered the hallway. Yet, around 5 a.m. that morning, no one in the neighborhood reported hearing a bark before the gunshots. For investigators, that was significant, because there was another possibility. Perhaps the person moving through the house wasn't a stranger at all. Perhaps Bailey recognized him. Perhaps she didn't see him as a threat. And if that were true, the identity of the person inside the bedroom became even more important. Investigators also asked another question. Why would supposed robbers waste time and ammunition on a family dog? Matthew's explanation was that the intruders killed Bailey for no particular reason, but investigators weren't convinced. In a staged crime scene, Bailey represented a potential problem. She could bark, she could draw attention, she could react to a stranger, and she could disrupt the illusion of a break-in. Her death therefore appeared to investigators less like a random act and more like something deliberate. Someone who knew the dog could have understood exactly how she might react. Bailey May couldn't tell investigators what she had seen, but the evidence surrounding her death became another clue. another indication that whoever entered that bedroom may not have been a stranger. While Matthew remained under medical observation, investigators turned to his electronic devices. His phone, his computer, the devices had been seized from the Eagle Landing home, and they contained a record of activity from the days leading up to the shooting. According to the cyber forensics evidence described in the case, Matthew's online activity had taken a dark and specific direction. His browser history showed numerous visits to pages involving toxicology and techniques related to staging criminal scenes. Investigators said he wasn't simply reading one article. He had spent hours on specialized forums and had gathered detailed information. There were also screenshots on his phone showing maps and possible routes out of the neighborhood, routes that could theoretically have been used by someone trying to leave without being noticed. But the timing was especially important. Some of these searches had occurred late at night, while Caitlin was still in the house. For investigators, that created a serious contradiction. Matthew was claiming that the home invasion had happened suddenly, yet his digital activity suggested that he had already been thinking about elements associated with such a crime. The digital trail became a major part of the prosecution's case, but investigators still needed to understand why. What would motivate Matthew to create an elaborate story about intruders? To answer that, detectives examined two areas: his relationships and his finances. One of the most revealing witnesses was an ex-girlfriend. Matthew had reconnected with her several months before June 2020. She provided investigators with messages in which Matthew reportedly described his current marriage as little more than a formality. He indicated that he intended to take care of the situation so he could begin a new life with her. But another witness gave investigators a different perspective. A co-worker of Matthew's described a man who appeared less concerned with the emotional side of the marriage and more concerned with the financial consequences of ending it. According to her, Matthew rarely complained about Caitlin as a person. His frustrations centered on the practical problems surrounding a divorce, especially the house. Matthew reportedly believed Caitlin would never agree to sell the Hanahan property. A legal divorce could mean losing the home he valued. It could also mean years of financial obligations. Then investigators learned something even more revealing. Matthew had reportedly asked his co-worker what normally happened to shared real estate if a spouse unexpectedly died. That question suddenly took on a different meaning. If Caitlin died, Matthew could potentially keep the house. He could begin a new life with someone else. And he could avoid the financial consequences associated with divorce. For investigators, a possible motive was taking shape. The relationship provided one element, the property provided another, and the digital searches appeared to provide evidence of preparation. But there was still one person who had to explain the contradictions: Matthew himself. After being discharged from the hospital, Matthew Speck entered the interrogation room. Detectives had already spent days examining the evidence. Now they wanted him to explain the details. They used a strategy built around contradictions. Matthew repeated his claim that he had chased the intruders through the hallway and toward the door. Then detectives asked the question that his story couldn't easily answer. If he had chased them, how was the front door locked from the inside? And why were the windows undamaged? Matthew struggled. First, he suggested that he might have locked the door himself while in shock. Then, his explanation shifted. At one point, he referred to the intruders as almost phantom-like. But the physical evidence was already working against him. Detectives presented the forensic findings concerning his wounds. They pointed out the shallow cuts, the absence of expected defensive injuries, and the lack of gunpowder residue on his clothing that would have supported the close-range struggle he described. His story was collapsing, but detectives weren't finished. They had one final category of evidence: his own search history. They read the searches back to him. Information about how to fake a robbery. Information concerning lethal doses of cyanide. Matthew went silent. There was no convincing explanation for why his searches appeared so closely connected to the crime scene investigators had discovered. The locked house, the controlled injuries, the lack of forced entry, the untouched valuables, the dead dog, the digital evidence, and the possible motive. There was no longer much room for the story of mysterious intruders. Matthew Speck was arrested, and he never provided a real explanation for why his online activity appeared to mirror so many elements of the crime. Investigators then reconstructed the sequence of events using ballistic evidence, blood evidence, and digital records. According to their reconstruction, the events didn't begin at 5 a.m. They began earlier. Matthew waited until Caitlin was asleep. He retrieved the weapon. It had been prepared and loaded. Inside the house were Caitlin, Matthew, and Bailey May. Then the first shots were fired in the upstairs bedroom. Caitlin was still in bed. She never had an opportunity to react. There were no defensive movements identified in the account presented by investigators. Immediately afterward, Matthew turned the weapon toward Bailey May. The dog was shot where she lay. Now there were no other living beings inside the house except Matthew. And according to investigators, that was when the staging began. Matthew moved through the home. He carefully created what he wanted investigators to interpret as a break-in. But he didn't destroy everything. The valuable electronics remained. The home's interior remained largely intact. The objects he intended to keep were left untouched. The scene had a purpose. It needed to suggest an outside attack. Then Matthew went into the bathroom. Using a sharp object, reportedly later associated with his DNA, he inflicted shallow cuts on his arms and abdomen. The injuries were controlled. They were severe enough to make him appear like a victim, but not severe enough to seriously endanger him. And only after the scene had been prepared did he make the call. At approximately 5 a.m., emergency services received his report. The time between the shooting and the emergency call also helped investigators explain why blood on Caitlin and Bailey had already begun drying when medical personnel arrived. According to the reconstruction, the entire sequence had been deliberate. A crime had occurred, then a second crime scene had been created around it, and finally, Matthew presented himself as the survivor. Number, the trial, November 2024. The trial began in Berkeley County Court. Prosecutor Alexander Myers approached the case methodically. The prosecution relied heavily on technical evidence. A forensic pathologist explained why Matthew's wounds could not be reconciled with the struggle he described. The injuries, prosecutors argued, were evidence of planning. Then, ballistics experts presented their findings. The bullet angles in the bedroom indicated that the shooter had been standing still. The targets were not moving in a way that suggested a chaotic gunfight. The shell casings found near Caitlin and Bailey matched, and prosecutors emphasized one point. The person firing those shots had time. There was no evidence of someone rushing through the house, no evidence of a frantic escape. The house was sealed. The person responsible appeared to know that no one was going to interrupt. Then, witnesses discussed Matthew's relationships. His former girlfriend described the relationship they had resumed. His coworker discussed his concerns about the house and financial obligations. Together, their testimony supported the prosecution's argument concerning motive. The defense attempted to create doubt by pointing to the limited quality of nearby security camera footage. The argument was that the cameras could not conclusively prove that no intruders had entered. But the prosecution returned to the physical evidence. There was still no evidence of anyone entering the home, and no evidence of anyone leaving it. The case didn't depend on one camera. It depended on the entire scene. After 5 days of testimony, the trial approached its end. Number, the verdict. On the final day, the jury was reminded of the central contradiction. Matthew claimed he had chased attackers through the house, but the house had been physically locked from the inside. His story required an escape. The evidence provided none. His story required a violent struggle. The forensic evidence did not support one. His story suggested a robbery, yet the valuables remained untouched, and his digital history raised questions about preparation. The jury did not take long to deliberate. Then, everyone returned to the courtroom. The atmosphere was silent. Judge Dedra Jefferson received the verdict. Matthew Garrett Speck was found guilty on all counts described in the source material: premeditated homicide, cruelty toward an animal, and unlawful use of a firearm. Caitlin's mother and sister were seated in the gallery. They received the verdict through silent tears. It wasn't necessarily unexpected, but the verdict represented something different: official confirmation. The man they had once welcomed as family had been convicted as Caitlin's executioner. The jury had accepted the prosecution's argument. This was not an unpredictable home invasion. It was a calculated plan, and the evidence had followed that plan backward, from the internet searches, to the shooting, to the stage scene, to the fake injuries, and finally, the emergency call. The final chapter came with sentencing. Judge Jefferson sentenced Matthew Speck to life in prison without the possibility of parole. An additional 10 years were added according to the source material, making early release based on good behavior legally impossible under South Carolina law. The court emphasized that Speck had not simply committed a crime. He had also attempted to manipulate the justice system by staging a false attack. The calculated nature of the plan became an important part of the sentence. As described in the source material, Matthew Speck is now serving his sentence in a South Carolina correctional facility designated as without possibility of release. But the case didn't end with the sentence. There was still the house, the property at the center of the motive. Under state law, a person cannot benefit from their own offense. The Eagle Landing property was therefore transferred to Caitlin's heirs. The home that had once represented Caitlin's plans for the future was now permanently connected to the crime that ended her life. The Caitlin Speck case began with a phone call, a frightened voice, a claim of two intruders, a husband saying that he had survived an attack. But the story changed as investigators examined the evidence. The doors were locked, the windows were intact, the valuables were untouched. There was no obvious forced entry. Matthew's injuries didn't match the struggle he described. Bailey May's behavior raised questions about whether the killer was really a stranger. And then, investigators found the digital trail. Searches, information, maps, activity that appeared to connect Matthew to the kind of crime scene he later claimed had happened to him. Then came the motive. A marriage that had become emotionally distant. Another relationship, a home Matthew reportedly didn't want to lose. Questions about what would happen to shared property if Caitlin were suddenly gone. Finally, there was the interrogation. When detectives placed the contradictions in front of Matthew, his story began to break apart. The alleged intruders had no clear entry point, no clear exit, no clear reason for leaving the valuables behind, and no physical evidence that they had ever been there. The home invasion story was collapsing. What remained was a much darker explanation. According to the prosecution's case, Caitlin wasn't killed by a stranger who broke into her home. She was killed inside the home she believed was safe. And Bailey May was killed too. The scene was then staged to make investigators believe that someone from outside had entered. But the house itself became one of the most important pieces of evidence. Its locked doors, its intact windows, its untouched belongings, its lack of a clear escape route. Everything that was supposed to support the story of an intruder instead challenged it. The digital evidence added another layer. And the testimony concerning relationships and finances provided a possible motive. Eventually, the evidence became stronger than the story. Caitlin Speck and Bailey May could never tell investigators what happened that morning. So investigators had to reconstruct the truth from everything left behind. The physical evidence, the forensic evidence, the digital evidence, the testimony, and the contradictions. In the end, the story that began with a supposed home invasion ended with a conviction. The emergency call was real. The injuries were real. The deaths were real. But according to the verdict, the intruders were not. The danger had never needed to break through the front door. It was already inside the house, and the evidence was waiting there, quietly, piece by piece, until the story could no longer hold together. Caitlin's home was supposed to be her sanctuary. Instead, it became the center of an investigation that exposed a carefully constructed story. And ultimately, it wasn't the person who made the emergency call who revealed the truth. It was the evidence left behind. Because a staged crime scene can tell a story, but eventually the evidence tells its own. Please like and subscribe.